seen this woman's face. I mean, you know, she felt like it was just such a moving thing for her to see where this story happened. So when I spoke the first time about Ole Nystel's story, and I just did it over and over and over again, she had decorated the church, and you know, there's no electricity. It's about half the size of this room, but it looks like something from Little House on the Prairie. And it's like people were captivated by his story. And this man, a lot of people came up to me, but this one man in particular, he said, I have lived in Clifton all my life and I had never heard this story before. And it was Dr. Law. And so, you know, I realized it's a story that needs to be told. So in 1867, this is the year that Ole Nystel was captured. Y'all can all hear me, can't you?
Yes.
BOSQUE County had only been in existence for 13 years, and Clifton wasn't yet located where we're at today. That wouldn't come until 1881 when the Santa Fe Railroad moved through town in its current location. At that time, it was 2 or 3 miles from here on the east side of the BOSQUE River, out in the area of the airport. There were only about, I know you guys that do genealogy like censuses. In the 1860 BOSQUE County census, there were 103 Norwegians. The first came here in 1854, the year the county was organized. In 1870, there were 386 people in the census that claimed Norway as their place of birth. And by 1880, there were 851. And then it had pretty much stopped by 1900. Most of the Norwegians that lived here were in this 18-mile stretch between Clifton and Cranfell's Gap that we call the Norse Historic District. The large immigration of Norwegian immigrants began after the Civil War ended in 1865, because during the years of the war, the soldiers that were normally stationed on the western fringes of the frontier, they were sent to fight for the Confederacy in the South. And these were the years that the latter Indian raids occurred here in BOSQUE County and Erath County, in this area that we live in. Ole Nystel was born in one of the 2 East Texas settlements. Before the Norwegians came to BOSQUE County, there were 2 settlements in Henderson and Van Zandt counties in eastern Texas, and they were considered failures. They suffered from flu epidemics, and more than half of the people died. And they started scouting out an area here in BOSQUE County in 1853 for possible relocation. And Ole Nystel's parents lived in East Texas at that time. But even though the land was free and that was an incentive to come here, the Norwegians were terrified of the Indians because they didn't have anything like this back home. Ole Nystel was born in 1853. He was the youngest, he was the oldest of 3 children born to Terry Nystel and Signe Knutson. Julie's like related, I don't even know if I've told you, but she's related to both the Turgesons and the Knutsons. Terry Nystel's middle name was Turgeson. His father's parents immigrated to the United States from Norway in 1850 along with 6 of their 8 children, and they settled in Henderson County, where Ole's mother died in 1861 when he was 8 years old and she was 28. Ole's father remarried in 1865, and the family moved to the Norse area in 1866 after the Civil War, and they farmed near the location of the present day Our Savior's Lutheran Church. It was there on the morning of March the 20th, 1867, that Ole and his father were about to begin work planting corn, when their neighbor, Carl Quasted, stopped by the Nystels' farm and asked if Ole could help cut cedar on nearby Golden Mountain, which was about 5 miles away. Ole was 14 years old. Mr. Quasted, some of you have heard of, his house is right next to where Our Savior's Lutheran Church is. And he was probably one of the most revered and respected of the Norwegian immigrants. He was in the first group that came here, the first 9 families in 1854. He was very successful, and his farm is considered the best preserved Norwegian home state in Texas. And it's just undergone like a very, very extensive renovation. If you go online, you can look at it. It's pretty amazing. I haven't seen it yet. But the McConaughey's that own, I think he's a doctor maybe in the Metroplex, but anyway, they're going to have, I think it may be on the Homes Tour this year. So this Golden Mountain would also be located, like I said, where Patsy grew up, out off Highway 2136. And today it's owned by John and Darlene Thomas. In Quayston, he was in his mid-50s at this time, and he had been, like I said, one of the first Norwegians to settle here in BOSQUE County. So Ole accompanied Carl Quayston, and shortly after they arrived, they were attacked by a small band of Comanche braves. The arrows began to fly and war cries, and Ole was shot immediately through his right leg through the knee. And Mr. Quayston was shot in his arm, but he escaped certain death by leaping over 60 feet off of the limestone cliff that Patsy and I got to look at. And he landed in a cedar tree that cushioned his fall. And he ran all the way back. He ran all the way back to his house, and his daughter Martha, she was a noted equestrian, and he sent her because he was injured, and she went to all the neighboring farms, and she asked them to come back to the Quayston's house, and they were going to organize a posse. And she rang a bell that's on top of the blacksmith shop that still stands out there on the Quayston property. This search party, they left to look for Ole Nystel, but they lost the tracks around there's somebody trying to get in over there. Anyway, the search party they left that was looking for Ole Nystel, they lost the tracks in the snow. This was over near Iredell. And this same group of Indians are probably responsible for killing a couple of other people in that area during this same excursion down here. Attacks by the Indians and the capture of pioneer children during this particular time in the Western movement in Texas wasn't uncommon, actually. Another notable incident happened that I was talking to Galen about just 4 months later in July of 1867, when Hamilton County school teacher Ann Whitney was pierced by an estimated 18 arrows and shot twice by Comanches as she struggled to shelter her school children. Are all of you familiar with that story? You know, oh, it's a wonderful program. And if you've been to the elementary school over at Whitney, it's called the Ann Whitney School, and I always wondered why. And when I got to researching Ole Nystel 25 or 30 years ago, I found out why. She had moved here from Massachusetts. She wanted to come to the frontier. And the school was a country school. It was located about 7 miles from Hamilton. She was able to save all but one boy, John Kuykendall, who was also captured by the Comanches. And she helped the surviving children hide under the boards of the schoolroom floor, and then she concealed where they were hidden with her dress while she lay dying. And the Indians were, like I said, the elementary school in Hamilton is the Ann Whitney Elementary School, named in her honor. The Indians in all these incidences were primarily looking for horses, for transportation, and for currency. Capturing settlers was considered a rite of passage for young braves and a means to gain status in the tribe. Usually those captured were children between the ages of 7 and 14 because the younger ones were too much trouble. We know what little kids are like. They didn't want to mess with the little kids. And the older ones tried to escape. Women were occasionally taken. Men were almost always killed. The captured children were very seldom rescued, as the Indians had a great advantage over the settlers in their search parties. The pioneer settlements were usually miles apart here in BOSQUE County, and the Indians knew the desolate, unsettled areas of the panhandle of the Indian territories in New Mexico. The Indians took children captive for 2 reasons. Number one, the children were considered the spoils of war, and they were considered property for trading with other tribes or sold for ransom to the U.S. government. This would be the case with Ole Nystel and John Kuykendall. He was the boy that they captured when they killed Ann Whitney, the school teacher at Hamilton. He was held hostage for 11 months, and he was traded. You can't make this up, folks. He was traded for 4 gallons of whiskey. And they were glad to get rid of him. Children were often adopted as members of it. Number 2, the children were often adopted as members of a tribe, particularly to replace children who had died, Indian children who had died, and to increase tribe membership. Think of Cynthia Ann Parker. She was kidnapped 30 years before Ole Nystel, but she actually assimilated into the Comanche tribe, and she married there, and she became the mother of the last great Comanche chief, Quanah Parker. In fact, when she was, if you want to call it captured, when she was brought back into the white world and her family, she didn't live long. She refused to eat. I think the first slide may be of her, Galen. And thank you, Galen, for putting these slides together. This is Cynthia Ann Parker, and with Prairie Flower, that's her daughter, and she was the youngest of her 3 children. The first 2 were boys, and she and this baby were taken back by her family. And when the little girl died, it's like she quit eating and she died shortly after that. But back to Ole Nystel. Oh, one other thing, I read this last night. When his book was reprinted by the library here, Derwood Johnson did the introduction. Are y'all familiar with Elise Warren Skold, the lady with the pen? You've heard? She was a teacher. She was from Norway. She lived in Hamilton, and she's written most of what we know about what life was like here in the frontier days. But she was back in Van Zandt County, and a big group were thinking about moving here after the Civil War, and this is what she had to say after the Ole Nystel incident. She wrote everyone, "I must tell you something about the western Norwegian settlement in BOSQUE County." This is in 1867. "Not long ago, the Indians descended upon it. They wounded an old Norwegian," that was Carl Quested. "They carried off a 14-year-old boy. They killed a school teacher. In addition, they took 2 American boys whose father they killed, and they also killed 2 Negroes. No doubt, the BOSQUE settlement is richer than ours, and I think more beautiful and healthful, but still, I wouldn't for the world go to live there with the Indians." So that's the word that she put out to the Norwegians that were wanting to come here. So Ole was captured. He had been shot through his right knee. He was stripped of his clothes, and he was offered. They had been cooking a horse, and he was offered some of this horse meat. He refused to eat. And he said he had nothing to eat for 9 days after that. They were like, "You don't want it, fine." Then they didn't offer him anything. He didn't know it at the time, but his captors were actually what the government would consider tame Indians who had been placed on reservations in modern-day Kansas. And they spent the winter months there normally. However, these Indians, like a lot of them were known to, where the phrase "wandering off the reservation" comes from. They would wander off the reservation, come back to these areas where they originally were from, and usually steal horses, but occasionally wreak havoc, and especially during these years of the Civil War. Nystel's 3 months in captivity with the Comanches included mistreatment, suffering, and humiliation. I can't make this politically correct. Everything, I got in trouble when I wrote something on Facebook about Laura Ingalls Wilder. She's fallen out of favor because she referred to her mother referred to the Indians as savages, but this is what the settlers considered them to be at that time. He couldn't walk for several weeks because of the infection in his leg. So he said he spent most of his time naked, near freezing, and digging for roots or gathering firewood. And by the way, information for all my remarks are taken from his own written memories of the ordeal. He would write that it was his belief in God and his desire to return home to his family that kept him alive during his 3 months that he was with the Indians. One of the account of mistreatment suffered by Ole occurred when he was close to freezing. The Indians had a little sympathy for him, so they killed a horse, they skinned it, and they wrapped it around him. And he rode bareback or walked with that horse skin on him for over a week. The only problem was when they took it off, it pulled most of his skin off too, because it had become attached to him. So he was in a lot of pain and suffering during the entire ordeal. Somewhere in Oklahoma or maybe in Kansas, the Indians met up with their own tribe. There, Ole was treated much better, particularly by the women. Surprise, surprise, right? The women of the tribe seemed to take a liking to him, and he took part in tribal games and established himself as a survivor. At one point, he briefly escaped, and the Indians believed that he had some sort of magical or divine powers, and they treated him more kindly after that, and he took advantage of it. At another point, he met a 16-year-old girl named Molly who had been captured by the Indians near Weatherford, and each time the two managed to steal away or to even talk, they were beaten. Once in a June thunderstorm, the two made a daring escape, riding all night in the storm with the Comanches in hot pursuit. When Ole's horse gave out, Molly suggested that he jump on her horse, but he felt that they would kill her if they captured her the second time, so he slapped her horse. It jumped into a raging river, and the Indians captured Ole, but Molly escaped. Though Ole was now again in the hands of his captors, the Indians thought, if they're going to get anything out of this kid, they better ransom him before he gets away for good. So they took him to a trading post operated by Mr. and Mrs. Eli Sewell near Smoky Hills, Kansas, or Kansas Territory. And standing before the couple, naked, bruised, bleeding, and teeming with lice, is how they described him. The Indians bickered with Sewell for Ole's ransom. They finally agreed upon $250 worth of coffee, bacon, sugar, alcohol, tobacco, blankets, and cash. The Indians were now gone, and the childless couple looked to Ole as a son. They kept him for 2 months while he healed, and they prevented him from meeting the Indian agent that was stationed in the area, Colonel Leavenworth, the one that Fort Leavenworth is named for, because they knew that he would surely take Ole back to his family in Texas. Sufficiently healed and longing to see his family, Ole asked to see Colonel Leavenworth, and he did, and he bid a tearful farewell to his second family who had treated him so well. Ole next embarked on the second phase of his journey, his return home to Texas. Colonel Leavenworth reimbursed the Sewells for the ransom that they had paid the Indians, and the provision was made for Ole to return home on a government ox train. I don't know if y'all are familiar with those, but interestingly, it was carrying supplies to Indians. Ole was given $3. Are you thinking things haven't changed? Ole was given $3 in cash, a blanket, and also, interestingly, an Indian bow and arrow for his journey home. Along the way, walking side by side with the ox train, he would encounter his former captors, and even agreed to meet with them in a teepee. Somebody on the trip had given him a gun to conceal in his clothes, and when the Indians pulled a knife on Ole and threatened him should he return home and tell of his experiences in captivity, he pulled his gun out and he promised, and he told them that he was going to tell his story to everyone who would listen. So he finally arrived in Milford, Texas. So he's walked all this way from Smoky Hills, Kansas down to Milford. I think that's around Waxahachie. I know the zip code, but I don't know exactly where it's at. By this time, he had been gone. It was September 1867, and he had been gone for, and I'll get to these slides in a second. It doesn't matter when I do them. He had been gone for 6 months by this time, and he was very sick, and this kindly woman took him into her. She had a bar there, or a saloon in a hotel, and she let him stay upstairs, and he had been there for a couple of months at this time. And the way that it was described by his granddaughter is like he was kind of half in and out of slumber, and he woke up, and he heard these men's voices, and they were speaking in Norwegian, and he said he thought he had died and gone to heaven. Oh. But it was actually two neighbors, a Mr. Gremlin and a Mr. Hansen from Norse, and they were down having a beer in the saloon downstairs. Oh, wow. And he heard they were on their way to the Dallas area, and he heard their voices. And he goes downstairs and he's reunited with Mr. Gremlin and Mr. Hansen. So they cancel their plans and they're going to bring him back to Clifton. Ole's father, word got back to him before they got back home, and they met him in the Clifton area before they actually made it back out to Norse. Ole jumped off the wagon, he shouted to his father, and the two embraced, and he told the amazing story of his journey, which he would repeat over and over again to his family and his friends in Clifton at Norse for the rest of his life. Ole lived the remainder of his years at Norse, where he struggled for some time trying to connect his ordeal with the Indians to his faith as a Christian. Like 99% of the Norwegians, he was confirmed in the Lutheran faith. But he always felt that something was lacking, and even after he married and was a father, he still questioned the significance of having been captured on a Saturday and ransomed on a Saturday and reunited with his family on a Saturday. I got to know a lot of his family through my talking out there at the church several times, and they tried to talk to me a little bit about the Seventh-day Adventist faith. But of course, Saturday is their Sabbath, and they place a lot of significance in that. He went through great soul searching and introspection before he became a member of the Seventh-day Adventist faith 13 years after his ordeal with the Indians. There was a traveling preacher that came through the area that he heard preach, and he and several of the other Norwegians were converted. Later in life, he would say that he had been delivered from bondage twice, first at the hands of the Comanches and secondly from a life of sin. Primarily to alcohol and tobacco. The Seventh-day Adventist Church at North, which he helped to found after his conversion, it's the oldest standing church of that denomination in Texas. It was organized in 1880. The first burial in the cemetery was Ole's son in 1891. And early church services were held in brush arbors, and then in another structure before the present church was built in 1913. Church services were discontinued in 1927, but the church has been lovingly maintained by the family. And during those years, the Nystel family would observe a picnic on the grounds each year, as well as hold family burials and weddings. The church was restored in 1988 as the Little White Church of North, and it was rededicated by the Seventh-day Adventist General Conference, which currently owns the structure. The annual reunion and picnic are still held there each year. Julie and I missed it last weekend. They always invite us. It was held last weekend, and they have like a dinner on the grounds. After Ole's return, he grew to adulthood and he married Serene Hole at the age of 19 in 1872. They had a daughter, and Serene died in 1877. He then married Annie Olena Anderson, and together they had 10 children. The couple, along with many other family members and their Norwegian friends, moved to Floyd County in West Texas to Homestead in 1890. There they lived in dugouts for 9 years before they returned to BOSQUE County in 1899. The couple marked their 50th wedding anniversary in 1929, and Ole died at age 78 on November the 18th, 1930, and his wife Annie died in 1937. They are both buried there at the Seventh-day Adventist Church Cemetery, along with 8 of their 11 children, besides the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which he helped to establish. I found it interesting that among their children that are buried there are Oscar, and he died during the flu epidemic in 1918. And he was a missionary in New Mexico on an Indian reservation, and he was there helping with the flu epidemic on the reservation, and he got sick and he died. And they brought his body back to bury it here. And then one of their grandsons, Walter Thomas Nystel, who was a Marine and killed during World War II. Ole first wrote of his capture in his 1888 book, Lost and Found 3 Months with the Wild Indians. And this book was republished in 1930, and it had a third printing in 1967 by the BOSQUE Museum in Clifton. It looks like this, and they have copies if anyone's interested. In 1992, Ole Nystel's granddaughter published a contemporary version of her grandfather's journal entitled Captured by Comanches. So the story of Ole Nystel, it not only makes an interesting adventure, it also marked the end of an era in BOSQUE County because it's considered the last significant Indian raid. I talked to Ruth Ann about it, and she said there's some court record that mentions Indians stealing some cattle in 1868 the following year, but this pretty much all the publicity and the brouhaha that came about because of this incident with Ole Nystel, it pretty much brought attention to the problem that was still here, and reinforcements were brought in, and it's considered the last Indian raid in the county. That's all that I have as far as my presentation. I wanted to show y'all just a few slides. Do you mind killing a couple of the lights back there so you can carve them? I think you saw this one earlier. This is Cynthia Ann Parker and her daughter Prairie Flower. She's probably one of the most famous cases of a settler child that's kidnapped by the Indians, except she stayed with the tribe so long she didn't want to leave. In fact, she married an Indian chief, and then, like I said, her son, Quanah Parker, was the last great Comanche Indian chief. Okay. This is the Quaiston home out at Norris. Joyce, I'm sure it looked like this even when you were. It was pretty much two houses that were separate. They always built the kitchen separate from the rest of the house because that's where most of the fires started. And then the family, the Swensons, the grandchild that inherited, they built onto it, and now it's something else. Go ahead. And that's a bigger picture of the Quaiston farm. It was sort of the headquarters for a lot of the Norwegian settlement. And Mr. Quaiston was very successful, and he would bring these young Norwegian men over here, and he would pay for their passage to America, and then they would live with him and work for him for 2 or 4 years, I can't remember, kind of to pay back for their passage here. And the next one. I couldn't find a picture of Ole Nystel. They don't have one at the museum either. I would like to see a picture of him when he's a young man or a boy. This is a picture of he and his wife Annie. It was taken on their 50th wedding anniversary in 1929. And this is a copy. This is a reproduction of the book that he wrote in 1888. Of course, this is a newer copy done by the BOSQUE Museum, but it's got an introduction by Derwin Johnson, but it's not made contemporary like his granddaughter did. Okay. And this is his granddaughter. She wrote this book around 1990, captured by the Comanches, so that it would be more appealing to modern readers. Okay. And this is hard to see, but it's a map that Ole Nystel drew, and it just shows the path of his that he took from his capture down here in BOSQUE County, way up into Smoky Hills, Kansas, which is as far north as he went, where the Indians traded him to the Sewells for $250. Okay. And this is for those of you that may have not been to the North Seventh-day Adventist Church, this is what it looks like today. Hasn't changed much. Okay. And there's the sign out front. You probably can't read it, but it says established in 1890, Ole T. Nystel Pioneer Member. And that's just another shot of the church. Julie and I have been out there where there's probably, 3 or 4, maybe 500 people.
People come up on horses and carriages and motorcycles and everything.
Yeah.
It's really cool. And one helicopter.
Yeah. They got a historical marker now.
They do. We went there for that. That was in 2014. Go ahead. And that's Ole Nystel and his wife, Annie. And that's another picture of him. Julie's grandfather was born and grew up on the farm next to the Nystels, and he died in 1999. And I remember when I first talked about Ole Nystel, I asked Grandpa Lindbergh, did he know him? And he said, yeah, and what he remembered about him was the flu epidemic in 1918, that so many people had died that the ground was so frozen they couldn't dig the graves, and so they had the bodies stored in barns and stuff. And then when the ground would thaw out enough, they would go out to the cemetery and stuff and dig the graves there at Norris. Thank y'all. That's all I have.
Oh, thank you.